we've chosen all of our feeds to essentially reinforce our perceptions and reinforce our ego,
right,
our little self. And that is why we are so lonely, because really we dispel our loneliness by hooking into our big self, the ways in which we connect, the ways in which we have commonalities, the ways in which we can plug into that ocean of consciousness and really remember how I'm like you and you're like me and we're like trees and we're like animals and we're like everything, that we belong here.
Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There is no topic too big or too small. I'm Eileen Ruhoy, board-certified neurologist, and I'm happy to be here today with Dr. Gillian Ehrlich.
Hi there.
Hi. Dr. Gillian, you are a family nurse practitioner with a doctorate of nursing practice from the University of Washington, but started out studying Ayurveda, the traditional medical system of India, and also completed a certification in functional medicine. And prior to all of this, you were an outdoor educator teaching wilderness and community building skills, mostly with adolescents for the Pacific Crest Outward Bound School, an organic farmer, and you lived and worked at a community health center and domestic violence shelter on the Yankton Sioux Reservation in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Since completing your medical training, you've heavily contributed to the Edward Thomas Medical Respite, which offers emergency medical shelter to the homeless with acute medical issues. You've spent the last 6 years practicing functional medicine and Ayurveda in a primary care practice in a public medical center here in Seattle, and have recently come over full-time to the Center for Healing Neurology for both your medical practice to see our patients, as well as to build other ways for people to learn about healing and health, like through classes, the In Development online membership program, and this very podcast for Healing Neurology. Welcome, Dr. Gillian Ehrlich, as today's guest on the podcast for Healing Neurology.
Thank you.
It's so nice to have you here.
I know, it's fun. Usually I'm doing the hosting. It's really nice.
I know. It's exciting to actually talk to you and ask you about you, because I think our listeners are really interested in who you are.
Great. I'm happy to be here. And I like talking.
That you do.
I do.
So tell me, who are you?
Oh, God, that's a big question. So I guess the bio said a lot of what I do. Who am I? How do you... Now you've stumped me.
Well, I mean, your introduction clearly shows a life well lived thus far.
Oh, thanks.
So you've done quite a bit.
Yeah.
So tell me about some experience that you've had in doing all of this work that you've done in the past. What sort of sticks out in your mind when you think about who you've been for the last 20 to 30 years?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's... oh, my God, this is really hard. I'll edit that part out. We can talk about things that I have done, but as one of my old Outward Bound instructor partners said, looking at one of the kids, there goes Frank, once again confusing who he is with what he does. I think that who we are is often very separate from the things that we do. And the things that I've done because the truth is that I'm really curious about life. I'm really curious about people. And so one of the things that I really like to do is just have different experiences and see what they think, what they feel like, what happens in them, and what it feels like to be doing whatever that thing is. So living different places, being with different communities of people like Outward Bound, or working with a homeless, acutely ill population of folks, working in the inner city hospital, working at the Center for Healing Neurology. They're all just different ways of expressing our humanity and learning more about life.
So you're basically saying that who you are is what you do, and what you do is who you are.
I probably am saying that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I do believe that about you. I think that you've always led to look for ways in which you can contribute to the world as being part of who you are. And that sort of accounts for your varied experience in the different things that you've done.
Yeah.
So I think you bring all of that forward in and how you practice with patients.
That's very true. And I am really interested in health and healing. How we get the most out of this life seems to be to have the clearest mind and the healthiest body. Illness is, from the Ayurvedic perspective, is certainly seen as an obstacle to awareness, and our awareness is what gives us the clearest picture, right? When you watch TV or you listen to the radio, you want a clear sound, you want a clear vision of what's happening, and I think illness gets in the way of seeing those things. I think it's not always about having perfectly clear vision, but when the vision gets clouded or the experience gets clouded or the mind gets clouded or the perception gets clouded, you want to be able to figure out a way to clear that so that you can experience fully again.
Is that what led you to study Ayurvedic medicine?
Yeah, Ayurvedic medicine actually came to me through my childhood friend, Anisha Durve, who's also an Ayurvedic practitioner and acupuncturist in Florida, in Miami, Florida. And I was working for Outward Bound at the time. I was mostly, again, like in your introduction with adolescents, in boats in the San Juan Islands and the Canadian Gulf Islands here in the Pacific Northwest. And she said to me, I'm studying this. You should come down and see what it's about. And she told me what to sign up for. And I called and I paid my money and I showed up. And as soon as I heard Dr. Vasant Lad, my Ayurvedic teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Ayurvedic Institute, talk about health through the Ayurvedic lens, I thought, oh, this is what I'm already doing with Outward Bound. And so I took those principles from that weekend, which was, I think, about healing psychological trauma, which I've now done with him, I think, 3 or 4 times. I took those principles back to my Outward Bound students, and I found that for the 3 different constitutional types, Vata is the constitutional type that tends to be thin and light and restless and has a creative mind, learns quickly and forgets quickly. And in my mind, I can see the Vata student who I looked at and I thought, oh, we need someone to bring this boat to shore and anchor it. And I gave her, in very quick succession, 12 instructions. And I said, do these. And she went, okay. And she did it. And she was amazing. But with my Ayurvedic training, I learned to stop expecting her to ever be able to do it again, because learn quickly, forget quickly. It wasn't like learn quickly, remember forever. And so I had a more accurate expectation of what a person could do, what a student would do, how they would learn, what they would do well, and what they wouldn't be capable of that I shouldn't grill them on later and make them feel poorly about themselves. Similarly, there's another student that I remember testing all these ideas out. There was a Kapha student. Now, Kapha tends to be stout, strong, very stable, learns very slowly, but remembers forever. So we had one student who was this kind of heavy-stead young guy, and I did a test. I did an experiment. I taught him how to anchor the boat, and I told him really slowly and really specific steps over about half an hour. And a week later I said, and I didn't ask him to do it at the time, but I spent time teaching him. And a week later I said, anchor the boat. And he said, okay. And he got up and did it like it was nothing. Wow. And so I knew kind of what to expect of people. And for the Pitta kid, Pitta is, you and I are both very Pitta. We have active minds. We like information. We want to know why. And so for the Pitta kid who asked me why 1,000 times, I stopped seeing that as kind of an affront to my authority and just that there's their Pitta mind trying to figure it all out. And so I remember one Pitta kid, and predominantly Pitta. None of us are only one constitutional type. But I remember one kid who I went through this in detail with, answered every why question, and then we were cool. And then I could kind of say something and he would have respect for me, and we had a good working relationship, as opposed to me saying, like, just because I said so.
And so how do you apply this to patients? I mean, so are you able to just visually decide what dosha they are and then use that in terms of your care with them? So
dosha, you're exactly right. So dosha is the Vata, Pitta, or Kapha, these 3 constitutional types, of which we all have a little bit of each, but in different proportions and in different ways in our body. And it's true that by looking, it's not only by looking, but looking and listening, and hearing how people answer questions and what they've done with things in their life, with challenges or with successes in their lives, I get a really good sense right off the bat about what their constitutional type is and kind of where they are. If a person has a lot of deep disease for a really long time, I may not have an immediate hit on what their original constitution is. We've got our Prakriti, which is our original constitution, and our Vikriti, which is our current constitution. So it's essentially, in the modern medical way of looking at it, is we've got our genetics, what the DNA says to do and make, and then we've got our genomics, or our epigenetically determined status of how our genes are producing the proteins that make us who we are. And in Ayurveda, the perspective is that we're trying to always get back to our initial constitution, and that we can use anything in our world, how we breathe, how we sleep, the food that we eat, how we think about our lives, how we exercise, the kind of work that we do in order to support us through the seasons and the years and the stages of our life to maintain that original constitution. And so sometimes if a Vikruti or a current constitution, a current expression of the DNA has been aberrant for long enough, I can't always tell. You can feel it in the pulse. So sometimes I use that as a tool. There's an Ayurvedic way to read the pulse. But that's what I'm doing with patients is I'm listening to them tell their story, which is why I can't simply read it off of a piece of paper, although the person that brings the paper is either a Pitta person who wants you to know every detail in correct order and knows the value of that, or they're a Vata person who can't remember, so somebody along the way has said, write this down, generally. And so I look at what is it the person's bringing, and then how do I apply these different constitutional types into how I tell them to do their treatments or which treatments I apply. So a Vata person tends to be delicate and fragile, so you only give the Vata person one or two things to do, and you're very encouraging. A Pitta-oriented person or a Pitta abnormal person, with Pitta, they say in Ayurveda, you should treat Pitta like a wife and never say no. So I always encourage them to take this on as their own and do what they feel is best. And I give a very linear order, and I always give the whys behind why I'm saying what I'm saying. And then the Kapha person just needs to be motivated. So Kapha just needs to be pushed. And so sometimes it's not that I'm mean to Kapha patients. Kapha people are very sweet, but sometimes you have to be more firm and more demanding. Like, I don't care what you feel. You need to roll out of bed and do push-ups at 5 a.m. That's when Kapha generally feels best.
At 5 a.m.?
5 a.m. Kapha people who are healthy Kapha people often feel, and it's dependent, of course, on the individual, but to generalize, which you don't usually do in Ayurveda, but to generalize, a Kapha person who tends to be stout and solid does best when they get up very early. They don't get as much sleep, and then they exercise hard.
So it seems that your Ayurvedic approach really does complement sort of a more conventional approach to patient care, in the sense that you have a deeper understanding in terms of who the patient is. So it's not just about, giving them a treatment recommendation, but it's about knowing exactly how to incorporate that treatment recommendation into their lives and the way that they'll embrace it.
Yes, exactly. So any particular presentation of the human being, the body, the mind, and the spirit is going to be through these constitutional types. So for instance, Dale Bredesen, who's worked on this Bredesen protocol in the book The End of Alzheimer's, actually has some Ayurvedic basis to some of his work. I don't know how it'll play out over time, but he does talk about the different types of Alzheimer's being a Vata type, a Pitta type, a Kapha type. So Vata type of cognitive decline is essentially light, has the qualities of light, and kind of almost like the connections the juiciness of the brain has evaporated, so the connections can't really reach each other. And so that's a lack of hormones like your vitamin D isn't high enough or your estrogen is lost. And so as women lose their estrogen, then they get some cognitive decline, and that might be from that loss of juiciness, that loss of what's called ojas. And so the connections aren't as... they don't click, and so that can be one type of dementia. Another type of dementia can be a Pitta type or a hot. Pitta tends to be very hot, so an inflammatory type. And that can be from toxicity, that can be from inflammation. And a Kapha type would be a sluggish, slow, congested sort of cognitive decline. So maybe the brain is so full of either toxicity or pollution or ama, which is when the body, when you eat food and it doesn't turn into the bodily tissue, the heat and the consciousness it's supposed to, it can make junk, which you can see as a coating on the tongue that's called ama. And there's some pressure points in the body that show you, there's other ways to look at ama or this congestion in the body. But if that coats the cells, then the cellular communication isn't as clear. And that can be a Kapha style of cognitive decline or dementia.
So speaking of Ayurveda and neurologic concerns like dementia and cognitive decline, I know that you recently co-authored a chapter in our book, Integrative Neurology, that's going to be published by Oxford Press in the spring. What did you learn or gain from researching and writing that chapter?
I loved writing that chapter. It was so fun. And when we initially talked about topics for that chapter, we talked about different functional medicine topics or Ayurvedic topics, and I really felt like I had to write about Ayurveda. What Ayurveda knows, which Western medicine I think will eventually come to, is that we are spirits in the material world, that we are first and foremost a soul that inhabits a body. So our body is really important because it carries us. It's the vehicle, but that it's really our spirit or being kind of a pillar of light, which I know may sound like a hokey way to say it, but it's what I try to remind patients of in a visit. And it's what I wrote about a lot in that chapter, is how Ayurveda really sees our spirit, our consciousness, our perceptions that really drive our behavior as the root of our neurology. And that is how Ayurveda and neurology have this really inherent kind of companionship in the human body. And so a lot of what I learned doing the research was a lot of the slokas or sutras or a lot of the ancient tenets about how we are spirits in the material world and about how consciousness really drives a lot of our behavior. And our behavior is what structures our body to be healthy or unhealthy.
Wow. Well, the chapter is really well written and very comprehensive. And so it's nice to sort of know what you gained out of writing it, sort of putting it to paper, because sometimes we can have a better and a deeper understanding of what it is that we know when we actually put it down on paper. Yes,
and it was really fun to write. And if we're going to be honest about the work that we're doing in the world and how cohesive we want our lives to be, I wanted it to heal my neurology to write it. I wanted it to be therapeutic for myself, and it really was, in terms of finding that poetry around these scientific, both ancient and modern concepts of neurology. And at some level, I wanted it to be therapeutic to read. I didn't want it to be dry or stale or boring or a list of symptoms or a list of constitutional types. And Ayurveda, the science of Ayurveda, the practice of Ayurveda, was transmitted for thousands of years, initially as an oral tradition, and then written down somewhere between right around 0. So there's some BCE and there's some AD.
Right.
And so, but kind of in that 1,000 years, but kind of before and after 0 is when it got written down. And there's these 3 ancient compendiums which collect all of these sutras. And a sutra is a Sanskrit word which essentially means a thread. So it's the thread of words. And it's a way to remember something. It's a mnemonic, essentially. It's a medical school mnemonic. And it's where our word suture, as in thread that you sew together skin with, comes from.
Wow.
And so sutras were mnemonic devices that kind of took out the adverbs and some of the verbs, but it's really like all the words that you have to remember to write the things down. So writing this book chapter with a poetic flow to it felt like a natural progression of the training itself.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. And how do you incorporate all of your background in functional medicine into Ayurveda, or do you? Or do you see them as 2 separate disciplines?
They're very similar. So when I first learned about functional medicine through my mentor, actually, Keisha Ewers, who's also, I know it sounds unique to have functional medicine and Ayurveda together, but they're such a good fit. And she and I met each other. She's a nurse practitioner with a PhD in sexology. And she and I met sitting next to each other in an Ayurvedic class in 2004 and just immediately hit it off and have stayed close. And she is actually an Ayurvedic nurse practitioner as well. So she introduced me to functional medicine in 2009 or 2010. And as soon as I saw functional medicine, which is a systems biology perspective of health and healing, I could see that it had roots in Ayurveda. And so as the last 10 or 11 years have gone by, I've really watched functional medicine as it innovates and grows, inch closer and closer to the ancient Ayurvedic principles, which I'm really excited about.
And so so give me an example, or just sort of describe how you apply both of these areas of medicine and health and their wisdoms to a patient.
Let's say a patient comes in, and we can pick something neurological. Like, let's say a patient comes in with MS, multiple sclerosis, which we know is autoimmune based. We know that it lives in the immune system. And so I will do an evaluation based on partly on their Ayurvedic constitution and what they need for their life and how they should gear their life. as well as based in this disease process, how this particular process has unfolded, as well as the functional medicine perspective of a chronic inflammatory condition. So in functional medicine, we talk about things really only having 4.5 root causes. So the 4 are food, trauma, or kind of mental patterning, bugs. So that can include the microbiome as well as an infectious process. And it can be something infectious like Epstein-Barr virus or Lyme disease, or just an imbalance of commensal or friendly gut bacteria, as well as something like strep or staph or other kind of more concerning, or even something like C. difficile, Clostridium difficile, which can really be hard on a gut, can be fatal with toxic megacolon. So that maybe that organism isn't there anymore, but as the treatment has been like napalm in the gut, now you have to kind of recover the whole system. So that's the whole bugs piece. Or toxins or toxicity or pollution, which we know is having a deeper and deeper impact on our physiology. And then the half one is the genetics, right? Because we come in, there are some things that are determined by genetics, but even those can be epigenetically impacted. So sickle cell anemia is a perfect example. If you have the chromosomal abnormality, it's just one base pair different, then you have sickle cell anemia, but it doesn't always present itself. So we can impact how it presents if a person stays hydrated and it doesn't stress out. So, which is obviously way easier said than done, but can be very, very painful. So those genetics those red blood cells don't necessarily have to sickle if the right conditions stay in play. So most of our genetics is like that, which is a half. So the 4.5 causes of things in functional medicine are bugs, trauma, toxins, food, and genetics.
That's fascinating. So comprehensive, it just sort of takes into account, it really sort of speaks to this idea of holistic approaches, which I think is a word that's thrown around fairly often and without true definition. But it seems like these tenets sort of really encompass that and embrace a true holistic approach.
Yes, they really do. So we're looking at all the causes in a modern life. We're also looking at what is the nature of humanity.
Right.
And one of the stories that I commonly tell is that we are not our disease. In fact, we're not even really our bodies, right? We're still that pillar of light. So whatever is happening to this body is going to carry us. But because we have a chronic disease doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be miserable. We were just talking about it the other day. Many children who have deep disease, muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, they can be very joyful children because they've not had a different life. It doesn't necessitate our misery, anything that happens in our bodies. And so finding that balance between our health and our joy and what's happening in our physical body.
Right. And what about the alternative, which we often talk about here in this clinic, which is that someone who's led a very normal, healthy life by regular standards, and then have this diagnosis that's considered terminal, progressive, degenerative. So their world is different, their lives are different, their abilities are different. And so how do you counsel them to sort of embrace this new normal, as the saying goes, or this new life that they have?
There's many, many ways to talk about it. I think we get very scared of our feelings. We get very scared of feeling badly or of pain. And I think that we are stronger than we know. So reminding a person of their strength is one bedrock for finding your way through this. The second thing is trying to figure out what we do with that information and what we do with that diagnosis, and staying in the driver's seat in terms of what we decide to do with our course of treatment. So there's nothing that says you have to do any of the treatments. You get to make a decision about how you want to move forward, even though you may not know the outcome. And there are people who say, the treatment is worse than the disease. There's people who wish they had done treatment that get to the end and say, oops, I made a mistake. So the idea is just to keep your eyes open through whatever this process is. And to do that, we really need to have a network or community of support so that your burden of emotion and feeling has a place to go, can kind of roll downhill, and that we share that as a community. That's what we're supposed to do. That's how human beings are supposed to work. Mm-hmm. We're supposed to share each other's burdens. And I think being dependent on is just as important for us as being able to depend on others. And I think we're really missing that in our society right now.
And so if we don't have others to share that burden with, how does that affect our health? I guess that another way of asking that question is loneliness a problem?
Yeah, loneliness is a huge problem, and social media just amplifies that excruciatingly. And so one is figuring out how do we make connections and going after connection and finding authentic relationships where we can trust each other and we can be in community. The other piece is that if that's not a possibility, if that's not available, then how do you make friends with yourself? And one of the things in my life that has been really important for that component has been being friends with the earth, because the earth can really take anything that you can bring. So, you can take a baseball bat to the ocean as many times until you are exhausted, and the ocean still won't give a shit. You can bring anything you've got to the external world, to nature, and they will embrace it and tolerate it. So there's nothing that you can do that will embarrass you in front of trees, that will humiliate you. It will always just be, we are all just being here together. And in fact, when I talk to patients who've had a lot of early trauma in their life and we work on trauma, a lot of people do come back and say, I don't know what to do with myself now. If I'm not my trauma, who am I? Mm-hmm. And we talk about the importance that we're here to just perceive and experience and kind of respirate like trees. So how do you do that? Go be with trees. And this is crazy sounding, I know.
I don't think it's crazy sounding at all. I mean, I think it's one of those mysteries of life. Like, we know we are not meant to live in isolation. Yeah. Yet we are nature, right? But nature tends to live in isolation, although not really. I mean, what are the connections between trees amongst each other, or amongst plants, or even amongst animals? I mean, so we know that animals they're herds, right? They often travel in packs, and they protect one another. They groom one another. I mean, there's lots of examples in the animal world of community amongst those species. Yes. And I think that humans, we have somehow lost that. And I think there's an aspect to who we are as a culture, I think, that contributes
as a mammal.
As a mammal, that's right.
We're mammals.
We sort of have veered off. And so the question is, how do we reconnect with other humans? And like you said, I think, and we were talking about this earlier today as well, but people who have had only disappointment from other humans sort of are led early in life, led to believe that there's no one that they can really connect to. So how do you address that with someone? How do you address someone who's just had lots of early childhood trauma and really feels like no one really is there for them, and they can't really connect with others, and they don't share the burden, and they just take it all on themselves, only to their own detriment? How do you begin to address that?
So the first aspect is attentive listening. So that even in that moment, we model, kind of like my writing of this book chapter about neurology, trying to heal your neurology. Even in that clinical visit, my goal is to really find connection and be a good listener and kind of accept whatever their feeling is. It doesn't, I don't want to validate a feeling as in, he did me wrong. Yes, he did you wrong. But it's kind of like, I see that you feel that way. Tell me more about what that is. Mm-hmm. So even in the clinic visit, it's starting with that level of connection. And then it's having a discussion around where will you find connection just bit by bit? Just how do we bit by bit find our way out of our own minds? And I think that it's something that we need to work on culturally and collectively, because I think it's one of the single-handedly most impactful things that's lessening our lifespan is our lack of ability to be with each other. So, I've joked about it, and maybe by the time this comes out, I'll have already started it, but I really want to start another side podcast that really talks about what to do with feelings, because we've become really ashamed of any weakness that we perceive in ourselves. And a lot of times that is having a feeling. And our feelings are just here to give us information. Their goal is to try and keep us safe. But we have so many metabolic memories that often it changes the trajectory of our physiology. And really by discharging that emotion, by getting rid of that distress, by resolving it with, and this is what I talk about with patients, with EMDR, with hypnotherapy, with Ayurvedic Panchakarma treatments, with massage, with connection, with being out in nature, with being with each other, with finding one person to exchange an authentic conversation with, by cuddling and hugging and holding and contact, all of those things, even sex. I mean, that's, intimacy is often where we do our deepest work. That's one of the things Keisha says. And we are a society that is having less and less and less sex because we're like reading on our phones about our social media. What do you call it? The scan of the social media. Where I'm reading about the feeds. The feeds. Are they
what
feeding
is it
you?
feeding? I know. My feed for the day.
My feed for the day, right. So, and what those feeds are feeding you actually is we've chosen all of our feeds to essentially reinforce our perceptions and reinforce our ego,
Right.
our little self. And that is why we are so lonely, because really we dispel our loneliness by hooking into our big self, the ways in which we connect, the ways in which we have commonalities, the ways in which we can plug into that ocean of consciousness and really remember how I'm like you and you're like me and we're like trees and we're like animals and we're like everything, that we belong here. But our feeds often support that little self that we're so desperate to keep safe and secure. And that's how we can get targeted for election crap on the internet, because what we buy, and
we're so gullible.
We are so gullible because we are so scared. And in our isolation, we get more and more and more scared. So it really is taking a moral revolutionary stand, I think, at this point in our culture to find each other and to go for connection.
Gosh. That's powerful.
So that's what I'm trying to do in a visit with a patient is...
and that's why patients love you so much.
Thank you.
They do. I mean, they feel connected to you, and maybe that is a role that healthcare providers can play. And I think it's a scary role for a lot of providers because clearly they don't want to be someone's only connection.
Yes.
Because we all need more. But maybe a piece of the role is that you just connect with the patient and they feel at least someone hears them. Yeah. And that's a start, at least, to their true healing.
Yeah. It's very true. And the reason I do this work, to go back to that initial question of who are you, I think there is a piece of me that is desperate to remember my own universality, and to remember this in my own life. So I've tried to put myself in a situation where I talk about it all day long in order to remind myself so that I feel okay. I mean, we come by this stuff honestly, right?
It is funny that those things that help heal others ultimately heals ourselves, right?
So
I find that so regularly.
Yep. And we used to, in medicine, first it was patient-centered care, and that was the revolution, so that the doctor wasn't saying, you have asthma, the treatment is albuterol, goodbye. It was patient-centered. How does this fit in your life? Do you have cats? Can you clean your furnace? Like, tell me about your house. Tell me about your home. Tell me about your relationships. So patient-centered care, but now it's really become relationship-centered care. And I think part of the reason that it's so hard to be a doctor or a nurse practitioner or a PA or a naturopath or a chiropractor, any of us these days, it's so hard to be a caregiver because, especially when you're in a system, it's so productivity-oriented that you don't have time to make those relationships. And then your patient visits can't feed you back because you can't do the work that reminds each other of your human connection. And they have done studies. Medical care practitioners do have a higher rate of suicide than the general population. And as well, there's some crazy percentage of experienced doctors who've been in the field for a long time who are telling younger people, don't go into medicine. It's not worth it. Yeah. It's just hard. It's hard.
Well, because we share that burden with patients, and that's a lot of burdens that we take on when we see a lot of patients, so I think we share that burden, and that's sometimes hard for us to process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that is definitely a tragic part of medicine these days, I think, is that we're all just feeling so overwhelmed by the loneliness, basically. People don't have enough support, enough of a network to share their own burdens with them, so that it falls on the people, their healers. Yeah. Right? So, and that's just a lot. What's a daily ritual that you have to sort of help yourself prevent from feeling overwhelmed or burnt out? Do you have a daily ritual that you think is really pertinent for your overall well-being?
As I've looked back about it over the years, I have a lot of rituals, and I do spend a lot of time with a silent mind, or I at least try to. I stare off into space a lot.
So do I.
I know. I think it's underestimated, and I am in love with that. There was a study that recently came out that showed that more silence in the brain, less brain activity actually helped you live longer. And watching trees is one of the things that I still really love, just laying on the earth. In fact, I talked to a patient yesterday who's traveling, and so she doesn't have a lot of her regular routines. And she said, I just can't seem to rest enough. I can't get back on my feet. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And I said, then get a fancy sleeping bag and stay warm and just go lay on the earth somewhere, because it can be that final sink, and we have to start somewhere. I think being outside is one of the things that I really love. Exercise is one of the things that I love. Talking, I clearly use as a way to share my burden and my distress. Meditation, yoga, being mindful about my life. And I do a lot of crying, I'll be honest. I put on songs that make me really sad, or songs that like I've just developed the ability to cry to. And I'll just say, I'm going to spend these next 5 or 10 minutes kind of like sobbing for this sad story I heard today. And when I see patients, especially working with Seattle's homeless population, homelessness is a piece of a story that often includes a lot of trauma. And so there have been patients over the years that have had, I just can't believe they haven't exploded. There's so much trauma in their life. And I can't imagine having lived through all of that and still getting up every morning. And so there have been times where I have listened deeply to stories and I've had to come home and just cry and cry and cry. And when I think about my life, I mean, I've like stopped in doorways on the way home and sat down to cry. Sometimes you just can't bear it, and it's not our place to hold it. It's our place to help discharge it. And so you really have to do whatever that looks like.
That's well said. One of the things that have always sort of drawn me to you for myself is just your ability to see through the muck, right? See through people's baggage in terms of their own perception and interpretation of their lives and their trauma and what they're dealing with. And you just sort of get right down to the core of things in such an easy manner that I think it's a remarkable talent that you have that many don't, because many are clouded by their own, right? But you're not. You're just sort of you hone in on the individual in front of you, and it's not clouded by anything that you yourself have experienced or are experiencing. The other thing that's always appealed to me about you is just sort of your. You once referred to yourself as, you use these own words, so these are not my words for you or for anybody for that matter. But you once said that to me, that you just always considered yourself just at your core a dirtbag.
I am a dirtbag. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
And the way, and I think that's a derogatory term, and I wouldn't apply it to anyone, much less you. But I think what you were trying to say, and what it really appeals to me about you, is just sort of this sense of like humanity. Yeah, like we are just our bodies and how our bodies function and how our bodies work, and they're nothing to be ashamed about or embarrassed about. And we're part of nature, and that's who we are. We're animals at our core, because we are. Yeah, right, and that's how you've like lived some of your life. And when I hear some of the stories about how you're just so at ease with that part of our primitive nature of just our body, it's something that I was never sort of taught, and I was always taught to sort of hide things and be shameful of things and to deny things in terms of like how my body functions and works, and I think that sort of caused a lot of repression. But you are just sort of out there in a very good way, like this is who you are, and you make no apologies for it, right? And so, but that I think is what allows you to get to. This is my long-winded way of saying is that it's that part of you that I believe allows you to just sort of, cut through everything and get to the person in front of you and really feel them and hold them and able to nurture them, because we are all just like animals at our core, right? We're just we're humans, and despite the clothes that we wear and the jewelry that we put on and, our fancy hair and makeup, that's not who we are in the end, right? And that's not who you are, and that's not who anyone is.
I mean, I think that we cloak ourselves in jewelry and hairspray, or not necessarily any of that stuff. Whatever we cloak ourselves in essentially is a cloaking agent to kind of try and trick other people to think that somehow we are beyond our animal nature. But we are, and when I say dirtbag, what I mean by dirt, there's sometimes in the dirtbag world, we talk about that with like people who are climbers or skiers.
There's a dirtbag world?
Yeah, there's a like people are like, I'm a climber, I'm a skier, I go, I'm a skier, so I go and I camp out on the mountain the night before, and then I get up early in the morning for the freshest powder, and I get up early and I go skiing all day, or I go climbing, or but I really, and so sometimes people like that call themselves dirtbags.
Okay.
But
thanks for the clarification.
I know. So a lot of times it's just outdoor educators.
Right.
But we are dirt. So, but when you think about it now in the functional medicine vernacular of we are our microbiome, we are of the earth, we are, our soil actually holds so many nutrients and organisms that become our bodies. the component of dirtbag. We are a bag,
We're part of the earth, the dirt of the earth.
Yeah.
No, it makes more sense now that you explain it. But it is that aspect of you that I find to be extremely real and authentic, I guess, is that you are one of the most authentic people I've ever met.
Thanks.
Like you truly, when you speak of yourself and when you even speak of your family members, like authenticity just exudes from your pores.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's what patients sort of sense in you as well, which is why they connect so much with you. There's no facade. There's no facade to Dr. Gillian, that is for sure.
I feel like I watched...
She is who she seems to be.
I feel like I watched too many sitcoms in the 80s where it was like there was some misunderstanding that if people had just been transparent in the first place, you wouldn't have actually been able to have a TV show.
Well, Three's Company was every episode was like that.
Yes.
There had to have been a misunderstanding. Family ties.
All of those shows were
Happy Days.
Yes.
We're dating ourselves, folks.
I know.
No, I completely agree. And that used to strike me as well. Like if there just wasn't that misunderstanding at the very beginning of the episode, there would be no episode.
Yes. And so it feels like the work is hard. Like our lives are hard enough as they are.
Right.
Why make it any harder? And it's one of the components that I have in trouble with kind of embracing the use your ALS as a lesson. It's kind of like, well, yes, we hope that happens, but we never wish ALS on anyone so that they can get the lesson. Like the lessons will come. The life will be hard. Even if your life is perfect, even if you have all the money, even if you have all the privilege in the society, the life will still be hard. So there's no question about that. The question is really like, what do we do with any of that? And the other question is, how do we defend and advocate for each other so that we have the most that rise together, that we all kind of can have the ability to find ourselves and be clear? Because part of what we know is that if we, in a society, if there's more economic inequality, if there's more that separates us, if there's more racism, more any of the isms, more oppression, it means that all of us are more anxious. And it actually lessens the lifespan of everybody, even those privileged in the society. So if you think that somehow because you're white or wealthy or well-educated or live in a place where there's no oppressed people, like there's no gay people or disabled people or anything, that you're going to somehow have a longer lifespan, you're actually just downright wrong. You're fucked like the rest of us. We have to do this together. So that's part of the social justice mission of health. And honestly, I feel like we are one organism. So when I help I'm putting in air quotes, heal, because it's not really me doing anything except giving space, in my mind, giving space and educated guesses about what treatments might be most appropriate for an individual to get back to their original constitution and have their cells and their DNA find the metabolic way forward. When we do that, we actually help ourselves. So if I want my young son, to live a longer life and to reverse this trend that we have in the U.S. of a shortening lifespan, then I have to solve or at least contribute to the solving and the resolution of all these social injustices.
How are you going to do that?
I don't know. I'm making a podcast, the podcast for healing neurology.
I think that's a good way, actually. It's a start. I mean, I think that you've been interviewing a lot of very important people that are outside of the realm of what we do here in the clinic, but who clearly have ideas and thoughts and wisdom that can be applied to trying to heal social justice. Yeah. It's social justice, and it's also our health. How do we have perspectives? And some of these things so in Washington State, we've recently passed a state bill about paid maternity leave. That is one way in which we can actually support the transmission of the generations to build a healthy society. So it's policy, it's economics, it's social contributions, it's also food quality, environmental quality. We're trying, and that's what I love about our clinic here at the Center for Healing Neurology and our upcoming membership program, our classes. All of this is to move all of these things forward. And sometimes I get a little down because I feel like it's a tiny step in about 50 different realms, as opposed to one thing that I've gone really far in. It's not like I'm one expert in any one disease or any one condition or any one anything. It's like I'm
jack of all trades, master of none at some level. But what I'm really trying to do is make all of these things move forward together.
Well, but I think that role is important, though, and it shouldn't get you down, right? Because I think that there are experts in each field, but there needs to be people who bring it all together.
Yeah.
Right? Because an expert standing alone on it, just because they're an expert in one field, can't get much done.
Yeah.
It needs to be a collaboration, and so you are the ultimate collaborator.
That's
right?
what I'm hoping. That's the angle. That's the angle I'm taking.
So what do you see for you and the clinic in the next 5 years or so? I mean, when you sort of think of your future, of your vision, can you put words to it, or do you think it's still too abstract?
I've come out of such heavy practice. So I was seeing, 40, 50 patients a week, which is a lot for functional medicine visits. Mm-hmm. And by cutting down on one-on-one patient time, my hope is really to move us forward as a clinic to offering services in a way that moves all of this forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that we really are at a critical point in our civilization, mm-hmm. Where it is burning down around us, and we have to make some choices. And I think that there are people out there who, if they knew and had access to this type of information that we're talking about at the Center for Healing Neurology, not just in today's podcast, but about environmental degradation, about detoxification of lead and mercury, other heavy metals and pesticides and gadolinium out of the brain, if there were people who knew about autonomic dysfunction and how we can use meditation or breath work or yoga to find vestibular balance, if people knew about these tools, they would embrace them. And that there's people all over our country and all over our world who are hungry for this information, and they just need that drop of light to reach them. And my hope is really to build a community where we all belong, because we are all doing this together. So it's not just for one particular group, but it's really for our civilization. And I know that sounds lofty, and there's people probably, who are listening to this podcast who are puking a little in their mouth saying, go for it. We'd like to see you try. But we have to do the best that we can. And I'm going to do the best that I can to serve as many people as possible with access to this information.
That's beautiful. I'm honored to be partners with you.
Aww.
So thank you for listening today with Dr. Gillian. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also get more information from and about us on our website, centerforhealingneurology.com. Or even better, come see us in person in our Seattle-based clinic. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together, and we are committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.